And we immediately move on to the studio discussion. Let's discuss this strike with Mr. Alexander while it's still fresh. Whatever the enemy's motives might be, from a purely technical communication standpoint, 2 ballistic missiles in the city center. On a Sunday in August when there are many people, this is not just the use of some strike drone, these are ballistic missiles, which, firstly, they're expensive, and secondly, they are not launched just like that. What could this have been?
The thing is, the missiles are specially equipped with a cluster warhead, meaning a large number of fragments, shrapnel, that are meant to scatter. In principle, its action is such that it explodes as it approaches the ground, or any surface. And the purpose is somewhat different from that of a missile equipped with a high explosive warhead, or a missile designed to destroy fortified buildings, structures, and so on. The purpose of this missile is to target personnel or lightly armored vehicles, or generally equipment, meaning the aim of the strike is always such that, from a military standpoint, a certain number of servicemen should be concentrated in an open area who are to be directly affected by the fragments of the cluster warhead. That is, the use of such types of munitions in urban conditions where there are many civilians. Unfortunately, it almost certainly can lead to injuries, loss of life, and wounds. Does the enemy know about this? Do their commanders know? Of course they know. They deliberately launch a missile knowing that the victims will be civilians. And when we talk about motivation and approaches, the motives are absolutely clear to me. The enemy in this situation, as in the case with Kryvyi Rih, we clearly saw those horrific consequences that occurred there. The goal today is outright terror. What does it consist of? You know that elements of psychological warfare, which are described in Russian military textbooks, can be found including in open access and reviewed. There are clear elements on how to fight if there is resistance. The nation has the resistance of the people, meaning they do not submit to the occupiers and need to be broken. In the case of occupied territories, this happens through repression when the most active public activists, patriots, and so on are singled out, and they try to simply decapitate the resistance movement, so to speak. And in this way, Russia then represses and fights against it. When the territory is not occupied, it is necessary to strike, causing maximum losses among the civilian population and destruction of civilian homes and infrastructure. During the time of Russia's full-scale invasion, more than 1,000 such strikes have been carried out. Civilian targets were specifically in the crosshairs. That is, 1,000 units using various means, including missiles, drones, missiles of different types, and sometimes long-range artillery, where the enemy could reach, not closer to the line of combat engagement. These are strikes that were exclusively aimed at civilian targets. This is how many times Russia has committed the most horrific crimes and terrorist acts. And for that, it is clearly defined in Russia's psychological warfare doctrine. If you cannot break on the front, you need to break in the rear through psychological pressure on the local population. Plus, this is accompanied by conducting certain informational psychological operations when the focus of attention needs to be shifted from the enemy's guilt to someone internal, so that internal enemies are sought, who supposedly did not defend, did not counteract, and thus the corresponding panic is spread. The intended outcome is the demoralization of the population, a desire to end everything as quickly as possible under any conditions. It doesn't matter, just for this horror to end. You know, like a general statement without specifying the root cause of all this, and a distrust of the authorities, in the sense that something is being hidden somewhere, something wasn't said, meaning someone is spreading some version, didn't protect, and so on. So these are the intentions. Why plus sowing? Well, typical propaganda. Russia gets involved and presents its versions of events, which they also try to insert into our information space. And the result of these actions, terrorist acts, should be the breaking of the Ukrainian people, resistance, demoralization, disappointment in the Ukrainian authorities, and all the subsequent consequences for us.
Let's at least sign something so that...
Of course, of course.
Does Zhitevsky act only on one administration?
Exactly, exactly. These are elements of psychological warfare which, unfortunately, It is commonly believed that psychological warfare is waged only through information flows. It is conducted through information streams. But the elements of this psychological warfare include terror as an integral part in order to sow fear, chaos, and uncertainty about the future. Because we also need to understand that Putin, thinking globally, evaluates and approaches each of his subsequent crimes from this act of violence. They monitor and assess the reaction if it occurs. So they observed after Kryvyi Rih, there was an appropriate reaction. Well, yes, they condemned it, expressed sympathy in Ukraine. Someone said they would provide more support, that it needs to be given. Someone didn't say anything, especially across the ocean. They recorded the reaction, looked at it, and thought, yes, maybe we should proceed with that click. And, well, unfortunately, let's say lawlessness, we perfectly understand that impunity breeds further lawlessness. And that's why they use such elements of psychological terror. It's absolutely obvious and clear. As for the real war,
You said that such terrorist means are used when you can't change the situation at the front. The spring campaign has already started in Kharkiv and Sumy regions, as was discussed a week ago. It seems to me that the Russians are preparing for an active offensive during the spring period.
Offensive actions are being conducted in these directions. I can say that, as our commander-in-chief, the president of Ukraine, noted when commenting on a number of these issues, the president clearly stated that preventive measures are being taken, including on the territory of Russia, precisely to prevent the enemy from amassing a strike group that would allow them to actually enter the Sumy region, to approach directly to Sumy and so on. This group is being held back at the border. In isolated cases, when the enemy enters the Sumy region with small infantry groups or sabotage and reconnaissance groups, they are recorded. Such groups are destroyed, including the units. They work in these directions and destroy the enemy, making efforts. As for in the south, there was indeed a certain surge in the transfer of some equipment through the occupied Mariupol. But as of today, the situation there is under control. I assume that, let's say, the main direction of the enemy's offensive actions for the entire spring-summer campaign will be precisely the Lyman direction, that is, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk. The enemy wants to try to solve the task of capturing the Donetsk region for themselves. This will be the goal, and objective. They are setting themselves quite an ambitious task, because we understand that the Sloviansk, Kramatorsk agglomeration plus Pokrovsk are essentially the main directions of the strike. And the rest of the directions, too, they are, well, let's say now shifting their forces. Obviously, for what purpose? In order to try to pin down our units in different directions. Kharkiv region. This is the Sumy region. This is the Zaporizhzhia direction, to prevent the relocation of our groups to certain other areas. But there, Noak is an understanding, and our intelligence from the armed forces of Ukraine is working to understand what to expect and to counteract it. Donetsk region, it is under the spotlight. This will be such a main offensive. Let's say the primary one. And in the rest of the parts, these will be directions, but what is being said about the threat of encircling Sumy or Kharkiv? They were in 2024. And these attempts were thwarted by the armed forces of Ukraine. The enemy was engaged in Vovchansk, and even some positions were recaptured. In Sumy region, they were not allowed to enter at all due to the fact that the Kursk operation began and was conducted. And now there are no signs of direct threats to Kharkiv or Sumy as regional centers. But battles on the border, or battles in the northern part of Kharkiv region, or in the northern part of small strips. Along the border of Sumy region, this could happen.
When you read Western media about the world and Trump looking for tools, ending the war, stopping the front, and then you read the interview with the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Alexander Syrsky. It feels like, no, the situation is not moving towards peace. Because what Syrsky stated is that since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has increased its grouping fivefold. Every month, they increase the army by 8,000 to 9,000 people, which is 120,000, 130,000 per year. And right now, at the beginning of April, there are already 623,000 Russian troops on Ukrainian territory. This, in my opinion, is not signals that Putin is sending about readiness for peace, but rather preparation for further development of the war and strategic actions. some. How do you see this statistic? Does it correlate with the notion that everyone is supposedly ready for peace?
I would say that this year will probably be decisive in many ways, because now it is possible, based on the forecast that exists, to predict for this year and talk about what might happen. The plans for the spring and summer campaigns are already clear, and we just talked about them. Most likely the enemy will act in this way. We'll see. Regarding the concentration of forces, certainly one should not expect that Russia will simply make some gestures, and immediately reduce its grouping and say, that's it, we are stopping the hostilities. It is unlikely to happen, and it must be understood that even a conditional negotiation process that is ongoing between the Russians and representatives of the USA and so on. It still does not mean that the enemy plans to cease fire and its offensive activity. Of course not. They will use the situation to the fullest extent possible, as they are allowed to. And there can be no illusions regarding how the situation may develop further. I think that this spring-summer campaign will be significant in many ways. It is crucial not to exclude that as a result of it, and due to the negative consequences precisely for the Russian military units, they will be forced to go for a ceasefire. How long it will last is difficult to say here. A month or two, several weeks, half a year, what time it will be. But the fact that the Defense Forces units, through their actions, inflicting maximum losses and restraining the enemy, will accelerate this moment is a fact. Well, it all still depends, of course, on support. If you mention the interview with the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, there is a question about aid from the United States, and it has decreased, according to General Syrski. And according to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, the President of Ukraine, in an interview for CBS 60 Minutes, he paused. Such a pause, let's say, characterizing it, and noted that it would be desirable for this aid to be more. Moreover, Ukraine is not just coming out and saying, give us, we are ready to buy and pay for it.
The President noted that European partners are ready to financially support this money.
Absolutely. We are ready on absolutely mutually beneficial terms, absolutely willing to finance American arms manufacturers to leave and invest, including the money that is invested in the Ukrainian defense industrial complex, but also to invest in the American one, which is absolutely, I think, understandable. As of today, based on the position of today's Trump administration, it seems to me that this is an absolutely correct approach. From our side, pragmatic, understandable that, okay, we are ready to buy. The main thing is to make a decision directly to supply this weapon.
We will see what the reaction from the US administration will be, including the reaction from Donald Trump to this. A terrible blow to the Sums. Oleksandra Misyenko, military expert and serviceman of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Thank you.